Bitcoin mining is a 0 to 1 innovation because anybody that follows the rules of mining can participate in the money printer. So it decentralizes the money printer itself, which I would argue us in the US and around the world having a centralized money printer has led to nothing but human suffering over time. There's a lot of philosophical things that come with a centralized money printer that I can go into at some point, Benoy, but there's nothing but human suffering that has been caused by a centralized authority for money printing across human history, spanning back, around 5,000 years.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy, your host, the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited on this episode of the Solar Maverick podcast to have Kent Halliburton. He is the founder and CEO of Sazmining. We've had Kent on the podcast before. Kent and I know each other really well. I'm actually an advisor and early stage investor to Sazmining. Kent, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate you making time. I know it's a busy time in the Bitcoin community, especially with the bull run that's happening right now. It's always great to have you. Great to catch up. Great to see you. Kent, it would be great if you could start off talking about what is Sazmining and the great work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, Benoy, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It's wonderful having you as advisor, and just our connection goes back to solar days. I transitioned my career from the rooftop solar industry into Bitcoin mining, 4 or 5 years ago now. But the industry is absolutely dynamic in a very similar way that the solar industry is. I always, for solar-based audiences, like to kind of rattle off the similarities, because mining folks are always surprised as well when they find out just how similar solar is to their industry. So with Bitcoin mining, it's a disruptive industry. It's also emergent, meaning that it's sort of grassroots driven. It's decentralized, meaning there's no one centralized point. Your primary product is being imported from China. That's where the mining hardware is produced. And then your profits are constrained with Bitcoin mining by an energy network. And that's why there's a race always to find low cost power, but not just the mining industry, but the Bitcoin industry and ecosystem as a whole right now, which I got involved with in late 2015, early 2016, became fascinated with. It's dynamic and driven by Bitcoin's price action. So in a similar way that a lot of policy drives solar business activity, I would say that Bitcoin's price is the analogous dynamic. So when price is going up, which it has been of late, you get a big influx of activity. And then when price pulls back, you tend to focus a bit more on operational efficiency and managing what you just caught on the front side of your business with sales activity. So it's a fun industry to be a part of. At Sazmining, the business model that we're running is Bitcoin mining as a service. And so what I saw coming into this industry was basically a supply chain, which is how I think of Bitcoin mining, is you're manufacturing it because you have to do that with electricity, but you're manufacturing a Bitcoin and the various slices of that supply chain. I just saw that there was a niche in managing the customers on the front end and funneling them into data centers that was not being filled. And so in essence, we've built a Bitcoin mining as a service application. You can go to our website, sazmining.com. You have an e-commerce type of experience to purchase a mining rig. We get that procured, shipped, deployed. You provide us a credit card to pay your monthly electricity bill for running your mining rig and provide us a Bitcoin address. And the Bitcoin is sent to your address as your mining rig produces it. So we have a unique model in that we're customer aligned. So we don't make money selling hardware or electricity, which is where you see traditional hosted Bitcoin mining making its money. Instead, what we do is we take a share of the mining rewards on the back end, just 15%, to align our interests with our client to make sure that we're making the best decision for them, how we manage their hardware. And so that's what we do. We've built a platform to make it a seamless, easy experience. But really, our competition in this industry is for Bitcoin acquisition. Mining is the only way to generate new Bitcoin. And that's sort of a simple idea that went over my head for a long time. But just like Bitcoin itself is 0 to 1 innovation to have a decentralized ledger, ledger that you can't stop anybody from transacting on, whether you like them or not. You just can't stop anybody from transacting on it, which I personally think is a good thing. In the same way, Bitcoin mining is a 0 to 1 innovation because anybody that follows the rules of mining can participate in the money printer. So it decentralizes the money printer itself, which I would argue us in the US and around the world having a centralized money printer has led to nothing but human suffering over time. There's a lot of philosophical things that come with a centralized money printer that I can go into at some point, Benoy, but there's nothing but human suffering that has been caused by a centralized authority for money printing across human history, spanning back, around 5,000 years. So having a decentralized ability for all of us to be able to print and participate in the creation of money, which is what I consider Bitcoin, is a wonderful advancement for human civilization. So we give people the opportunity to do that as easy as, hailing an Uber or, signing up for a Netflix subscription. But that's what we do at Sazmining. Sorry to be long-winded, but obviously I'm passionate about what we do.
No, that's a great way of explaining. There were so many great points that you made from it as well. If our audience is not familiar, can you talk about what is Bitcoin and specifically that cryptocurrency and why, SAS mining is focused on creating opportunities for basically retail investors to get into mining without having to mine themselves, which I think is really innovative.
Yeah, and I realize I jumped way too far into the deep end of the pool too fast there for most folks, but let me just back up and describe Bitcoin. So, Bitcoin has been unfortunately way too politicized, which from my standpoint is somewhat sad and disheartening. So, if you're listening to me right now and you've had a knee-jerk reaction to the word Bitcoin, just know that you're having a knee-jerk reaction to a protocol. So, if you ever think about being angry at USB-C, it's kind of the same thing. It just doesn't make sense. And that's because people have attempted to politicize it. And unfortunately, I believe that comes because money is something that we all care a lot about and like to politicize. But it's neutral and it's just a protocol. And what the protocol does is allow everybody that behaves on it to be able to send transactions to anyone else without being censored. And so it's a decentralized ledger. So just like your bank maintains a ledger, if I send a transaction to Benoy here, and let's say he uses Bank of America, for instance, Bank of America is going to add, let's say I send him $100, it's going to add plus 100 to him. And then my bank is going to subtract 100 on the ledger they have. So with Bitcoin, what it is tens of thousands of people around the planet are running copies of the ledger. They have every transaction across all history. It takes about 8 GB at this particular point worth of storage. No, I'm sorry, I don't have the data storage. It's not large, is the point I'm trying to make, though. And it stays synchronized across all nodes across time. And that's how everybody having a copy of all the transactions avoids anybody being able to spin transactions twice and make sure that there's an honest ledger of all transactions without there being any central authority. So that's what Bitcoin itself is as a ledger. And then what causes those transactions to be so secure and uncorruptible is really the mining, which is what produces new blocks of transactions every 10 minutes. And mining is what both makes those new blocks, securing the ledger through the harnessing of electricity and leveraging encryption to do so. But it's also what generates new Bitcoin. And it's the only way that new Bitcoin are generated. So at this moment, there is 19.8 million of 21 million Bitcoin that have been generated by the Bitcoin network and that are freely able to be traded on that decentralized ledger that we call the Bitcoin blockchain. And that last 1 million, everybody's sort of initial knee-jerk reaction is, oh my gosh, what happens when there's no more Bitcoin left to be mined? And well, that's normal. The way the protocol works is that occurrence won't happen until 2140. And the reason for that is because periodically, every 4 years, there's a reduction in how much Bitcoin are rewarded to miners for the creation of blocks. And the way that is structured, that last million Bitcoin won't fully be mined until 2140. So there's still quite some time to be mining. I think that answered your question, Benoy, but dig in if I didn't get to everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's obviously great definition of Bitcoin. I think the other thing too, as you mentioned, it's finite, right? And obviously that's the difference between fiat currency used to be, tagged to gold, for example, the US dollar, and now we've had, inflation, the government's just printing money, right? So this is a way of storing value because there's a finite number of Bitcoin. Like, what do you say when people tell you, oh, like it's not like a stock? You know what I mean? Like, why should I invest in it? It's something I hear all the time.
Here's the thing, as humans, we tend to put things into categories that we know. And Bitcoin is something that is unknown, and you have to spend some time to get your head wrapped around. And if you've not spent that time, then the natural knee-jerk reaction is to put it into a category that you know. Most of us know is equities, but Bitcoin is not an equity. You're not taking ownership of part of the network. You're taking ownership in tokens that are on this decentralized ledger. And those have value because they have absolute scarcity and absolute security. So the reason why I say absolute security is because it represents the biggest honeypot on the internet and has $2 trillion worth of value. So if anybody was able to hack and get access to the tokens running on the Bitcoin ledger, they would have done so by this point because there's nothing more valuable on the network that they could acquire. And the fact that it hasn't happened is what we call the Lindy effect, which is one of the reasons why it continues to go up in value, is because every day that goes by, more and more people have faith and confidence that, holy cow, this thing is engineered to last any trials and tribulations. And there have been a few across time here, but we're 16 years into its existence at this point. 2009 was when it was first announced. The first block was mined January 2010, and it's basically had perfect uptime. So, the thing that puts a lot of people off with Bitcoin is they tend to think, oh my gosh, it's so volatile. I can't handle it. And okay, if you're going to compare current types of money, so you've got Bitcoin versus the dollars is really the fair comparison here. You've got something, the system is inherently stable and its price tends to fluctuate with supply and demand, versus on the other side, the dollar is inherently unstable, right? Because it's not based on math and electricity. Instead, it's based on politics backed and enforced by the full faith and confidence of the US government, right? So in a lot of ways, there's no tether to reality with fiat currency versus Bitcoin. There's an absolute tether because it obeys the laws of physics with electricity and the rules of mathematics. And so you have something that arguably is more real, even though you can't touch it. And that's confusing for a lot of people, that you can't touch this thing that actually obeys the laws of physics. But you can't touch electricity either. And somehow we've all managed to build industries around electricity.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. And it's interesting, just a couple of things that you said. Just obviously, Bitcoin is on a bull run. I think you could correct me, like the pricing got to 120,000 per Bitcoin. Now I'm hearing people say, oh, the price of Bitcoin is already so high. There's no point into getting into it as an asset class. Can you talk about your thoughts when you hear that? Just like for, what the retail investor is thinking.
The hard part is for anything 0 to 1, you got to go wrestle with it for a little while to
Yeah.
understand it. And so that whole talk track, I've heard it lots of times, right? So there's no problem with it. In fact, it's how I used to think, but I've come up with some simple definitions that I really like to use to try to educate people in a simple way. So first one is, and this is going to sound odd, but there's a community of people that I'll call them Bitcoiners that have come to the conclusion through studying this technology that it's better to save Bitcoin than it is to save dollars. Now, it might sound like a very simple and trivial idea, but I fall into that camp. I would consider myself to be a Bitcoiner, but it means that by definition, when it comes to the price on the front end, it's not that big a deal to me at this point. And that sounds weird, but it's because psychologically, I don't save dollars. I save Bitcoin. I don't have a plan to sell them. I just know as I save Bitcoin that has a compound annual growth rate north of 40%, that I will have more purchasing power. And the reason why I know I'll have more purchasing power year over year is because I know the federal government will print more money and they're going to debase their currency. So it's just simple math and logic. But it's a massive mental shift that you only takes work. You can get there to the point where you realize it's better to save Bitcoin than it is to save dollars. And until you get there, you worry about the price and you worry about what's going to happen with it and what's my purchasing power of my Bitcoin. And yeah, it's exciting when the price goes up because it means the Bitcoin that I have has more purchasing power. But at the end of the day, I've been in this almost a decade. This is consistent. The funny part to me is we see the Larry Finks of the world, we see the president of the US, we see strategic Bitcoin reserves, we see all these people capitulating, and yet there's this narrative out there that like Bitcoin's going to go away, it's tulips, it's going to blow up. I'm just like, at what point do you just say, okay, like, all right, I guess you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve. Like, if you're not going to spend the time to study it, okay, the boat might pass you by.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all great points. And I think it's still early, obviously, in the price of Bitcoin, and it's not too late. And you don't have to buy like one whole Bitcoin at one time. You could, obviously dollar cost average, or obviously use Sazmining's platform where essentially they're, I guess, mining Bitcoin. You could correct me on the price at like $49,000 per Bitcoin. And, right now, I guess the price is between 110 to 120 if you go through like Coinbase or a retail sort of platform. So, there's a huge opportunity to get Bitcoin at a discounted price if you use Sazmining's platform, basically allowing retail investors to have access to mining.
Yeah, I know that you've absolutely nailed it. I think there's a common misconception that you've got to buy a whole Bitcoin, and great, that might be a noble goal. But the people that have, I just saw a guy, geez, what did he do? Like $10 a week. He started doing that in like 2015, and now he's a millionaire. That's the sort of thing you get just by chipping away at it and transferring your dollars into Bitcoin over time. Now, I personally, and obviously I'm biased running SAS mining, believe that mining is the best way to get your Bitcoin, and your sats are a fraction of a Bitcoin, and there's 100 million sats make up one full Bitcoin. And so as a result, you can break it down like at $100,000, 100 sats equals $1, right? So that's kind of
Yeah.
an easy way to think about it, but you can start stacking sats and do it at the most cost-effective means by mining it. And that is the primary incentive to mine, is to acquire sats at a discount. And the discount right now on a daily basis, so this is just how much does it cost to run the mining hardware and how many sats do I generate? It does put the opportunity right now at about $50,000 per Bitcoin that you're acquiring by running a mining rig. So yeah, it's a great tool. And also the sats that you generate are generated outside of the system, right? So there's not any entry into the banking system here. You're generating those sats through hardware. We've coined the term wild sats to describe those, but they're sats that are generated right off the network, right? Like there wasn't any intermediary in between. It was just the protocol itself is sending those out for reward for the service of generating blocks on the blockchain. So yeah, very cool. And just to touch for a second, like what is the total addressable market of Bitcoin? I've spent some time in that area, and the primary use case that is being validated right now is Bitcoin is starting to be accepted as a store of value. And if you just look at the store of value inside of the marketplace, so forget medium of exchange or unit of account, which are the other two primary features of money. If you just look at the store of value, the most conservative estimates suggest that that market is $100 trillion that Bitcoin could address. The upper end of that is over $400 trillion. Bitcoin right now is a little over $2 trillion worth of value. So for those that think that they're late, I'm sorry, you're not. And in fact, Bitcoin has two unique properties that every person that buys Bitcoin experiences two very unique things that is equivalent across the globe. One, you always buy Bitcoin and it seems expensive when you buy it. And two, you never have enough once you've started to buy. You always wish you would have bought more. Those are the two truisms that go across to everybody I know. Benoy, I know you've purchased some Bitcoin at some point in time. Would you agree with those truisms that it was too expensive at the time you bought it? In hindsight, you wish you would have bought more.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's amazing to me to see like the run. I think I started buying Bitcoin when it was like 11 to 12,000 a Bitcoin. And then obviously this past year, like when it went up and then back down then went back up. Like it's been pretty amazing because I think at a certain time it was at like maybe 45,000 per Bitcoin. And then obviously now we're at like 120 in maybe a year's time. So it's just amazing to see. Like obviously there's a lot of volatility, but obviously that creates opportunity. And obviously people who are not concerned about volatility obviously take advantage of it once the price, continues to appreciate over the long term. And Bitcoin has been like one of the highest returning assets, I think, since 2012. So it's pretty exciting. But you're right. I always am kicking myself in the foot.
Well, no, you're not alone. Myself and every person I know has the same experience. Gosh, why didn't I buy more?
Always trying to figure out how to get cash and invest it into Bitcoin. It's interesting. We talked about this in the pre-interview, you mentioned it as well, how Bitcoin has become political. The
Mm.
solar industry obviously knows this very well, especially recently with the passing of the big, beautiful bill, where basically they're significantly lowering the solar incentive in a very short period of time. Obviously, people don't understand it because solar is the cheapest form of electricity that could come online the quickest. Can you talk about, I don't know if we focus this enough, but basically, Sazmining focuses on Bitcoin mining facilities using renewable energy to
Mhm.
invest into their platform. Can you talk about like the different projects and how that works? And also I'm sure people are thinking like, why is the current cost of Bitcoin versus what SAS mining could mine it at? Why is there that big sort of discrepancy in price?
Yeah, so let me kind of try to tackle that like one at a time. You're not the only friend I've got the solar industry, and I know a lot of folks are hurting from that transition. And I will say it is, I'm sure, painful for people, those sort of like abrupt market shifts that policy changes create. So wish everybody well going through that transition. And frankly, I've actually theorized that the solar industry is going to come closer to mining because the bonus depreciation does seem to be available for mining hardware. And when I explain the overlap between renewables and mining, maybe it causes some light bulbs to go off and people to look into mining as ways to keep projects on track or generate other economic opportunities. So at the end of the day, the biggest operational expense for mining is electricity, right? It takes a lot of electricity to run mining unit. And so to give you an idea, I ran these numbers recently. 1 megawatt of solar takes approximately 5 acres of land. 1 megawatt of mining hardware takes approximately one shipping container for comparison, right? And so we are very power dense and high energy consuming devices that want to run 24/7. Now, keeping that electricity flowing is probably the greatest challenge of Bitcoin mining because there's not many loads on the grid that have that type of a profile of consuming very dense electricity 24/7. That would be ideal. But the beauty is because you're manufacturing a Bitcoin and that is an electronic or a digital process, you can stop that manufacturing process at any point in time without losing any work or effort along the way. For loads that are on the electrical grid, nothing is more dispatchable than Bitcoin. And that actually creates a big incentive for grid operators because with the variability that is created from other more renewable load sources, they need something that they can turn on and off quickly on the grid to match that to keep the grid stable. So that's where we've seen a lot of advancement, especially in ERCOT with Bitcoin mining, is because it is an unregulated market. And so a lot of market price signals are allowing Bitcoin miners to grow and thrive there. And Texas is one of the mining capitals of the world, along with being very high density for both wind and solar. Now, if I go back at just a more fundamental level, when I talk about electricity, this is something I didn't understand very well until I got into Bitcoin mining. But okay, if the most expensive part of running your business is the electricity price, then what's the cheapest electricity you can find? And the answer to that is actually very simple and logical. It's the electricity nobody wants, right? What's the electricity nobody wants? Well, it's the electricity that's either produced at the wrong time or the wrong place. So coming from solar, where there's a lot of negative priced electricity, we know that there's electricity that nobody wants, right? And guess what? you can take that electricity if you've got power prices that are under 4 cents per kilowatt hour, and you can monetize that. You can make more in Bitcoin rewards than the cost of the electricity to generate. Now, for a lot of solar operators, they may see Bitcoin too much. That's a different skill set. I don't want to be involved with it. Well, guess what? You don't have to be. There are wonderful operators out there that would love to find cheap price power. If you reach out to our industry, they would gladly buy as much power as you can sell them for under 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, they would love to get it at 1, 2 cents. So, I think one of the biggest opportunities that I can think of, and it is completely theoretical, I've not talked to any folks, but I know that there's a lot of projects that are awaiting interconnection because they don't have the interconnection. They have no way to monetize the power that they're generating right now on a day in, day out basis, right? But you roll up a container of mining rigs, well, guess what? Now you can sell that miner that power. And so you can be monetizing and turning kind of a stranded asset into a revenue stream today. That sort of, effort is not a particularly high lift for a miner.
Yeah, that is actually really helpful for industry to understand that. And you did a great way of explaining it, in a great, simple, like way. Obviously, I think also maybe I'm so into both industries that it might sound self-explanatory to me, but maybe more complicated. But I think you did a great job of obviously explaining to it simply. It's interesting because, obviously solar and mining is about energy. What inspired your pivot from solar to Bitcoin? And how do you apply like your experiences in solar to SAS mining?
Yeah, so I think it's one of my favorite questions, Benoy, that pivot. So I got burnt out when I left the industry in 2014. I just had a lot of responsibility. I was running sales, software, post-acquisition integration for a publicly traded company that is probably remembered by some veterans of the solar industry, Real Good Solar. And it was a wonderful time, wonderful opportunity, but was just burnt out with all the responsibility. So I took a couple of years sabbatical, and during that sabbatical, I fell in love with a Portuguese woman and Bitcoin. And that happened to be in Peru, which is where I live now. But it led to my relocation into Portugal in 2016 and entrepreneurial journey into Bitcoin. And why I'm mesmerized by Bitcoin is because I realized that Bitcoin addressed a root issue that I would say was almost like if there's an operating system for humanity, it was like the load, like there's an operating system that sort of boots up your computer and then you're running Apples or Windows or whatever. It was like the fundamental like loading system of humanity seemed to have this root error around money. And if you looked at like the history of money and how it corrupted people and societies when it was centralized just over and over again throughout human history, Bitcoin was the first thing that's come along that actually has the potential to transform that. And when humanity has a form of money that is uncorruptible, it saves it. And as humanity saves it, it begins to think in longer term horizons. So I was just in Alaska actually at a conference, and I gave an example that I'll share with you here. But there is a church that was built, it was completed in 1890. It took 589 years to build that church. It's in Milan, Italy. And the question I asked the audience, and I'd ask your audience as well, is can you imagine the US society deciding to embark on a project that would take 589 years to build?
No.
No. It's just an absolute ridiculous thing to even think about. And the reason for that is because our time horizons have shrunk tremendously. And our time horizons, very, very few people realize this, have shrunk so much because we don't have a safe store of value. Whatever we save in dollars, we're constantly worried about, hey, that purchasing power is going to go down. So I've got to chase yield. So I've got to go to the equity market. I've got to invest in real estate. I've got to put my dollars to work. And then, so you've got a full-time job making money. And then you've got a secondary job to manage your money on the back end once you've acquired it. And it's all because you don't have a simple way until Bitcoin came along of just, hey, put my money into Bitcoin and then stop and forget about it. Now suddenly I've got all this time free, and now I'm suddenly aligning my time horizon with my better self. So the other argument that I made is most people, this isn't going to resonate for all of your audience. Let me just give a quick disclaimer there, but most people I know believe that they are more than their five senses. And whatever you want to call that part of yourself that is not your five senses, it's outside of time. And when we have longer time horizons, we align with that and we become better creatures. And you can see it in any society that runs on a hard money standard. They tend to think longer. That Milan church I talked about, that was started under a hard money standard. It was a bimetal standard of silver and gold. But when we think in longer term high time horizons, it's when we accomplish civilizational change that's for the better. And I believe it harmonizes us with the planet. So as much as, I got into solar for environmental reasons, I realized that Bitcoin aligning our time horizons as a civilization was a more effective way to harmonize our relationship with the environment and to be a more transformative tool than solar could be.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, Kent. I mean, and I think, obviously your knowledge of solar really helps within the Bitcoin community and the mining community specifically, like understanding energy. And also, I think too, like being international. And then also, obviously, I know real good solar really well. And obviously, like to have the many different roles that you did in growing a company, that applies to what you're doing at Sazmining. The interesting thing was I was actually on Sazmining's podcast when who's the founder and president of Sazmining, had me on his podcast. And then I had him on the Solar Maverick podcast. And that's actually how the opportunity with Kent coming to Sazmining happened. Kent listened to the podcast. He reached out to me and he said, I found it really interesting, the podcast interview with Will. And now it's been amazing because, Kent's obviously part of the founding team and the president. It's interesting, or CEO, I apologize. Will's the president. I mean, it's interesting too, like how a podcast, and now like looking back, actually, I was with Will this past weekend. Just interesting to like, because I know like the journey that Saz had and the business model, and to see, and obviously that was an earlier stage of Bitcoin too. And then to see like the progression of the company and the great work that you've done. I mean, I don't think you could have ever imagined that time, right? Because I was talking to you from Portugal when you heard about that opportunity. Then you were telling me all the stuff that you were doing with crypto, and I was like blown away because we hadn't talked. Yeah, can you talk about like how that happened? And it's interesting too, because to me now, like I know I'm actually going on and on, but you know, I was at Bitcoin 2024 in Tennessee and Nashville. Unfortunately, I didn't make it this year in Las Vegas. I really wanted to go. But it's interesting to me how everyone knows now in the mining industry or Bitcoin, like a lot of people know SAS mining, a lot of people know you personally, from my networking, and you've done a great job of like really being an industry voice. So I really appreciate you of the mining community and Bitcoin. And yeah, can you talk about that? And I have actually another question too, which I'm really excited to ask you. Like, I think in the US, and obviously you've lived outside the US for a while, we don't appreciate as much of like the currency sort of devaluations or hyperinflation that other countries see. So, I travel a lot internationally and I see like how, crypto, Bitcoin allow people to hedge against currency risk and losing that value of their currency very quickly, which we don't see it as much in the US, but we're obviously, there has been a lot of inflation. Obviously, the US is able to do this because it's the reserve currency of the world and, able to print without any of the consequences other countries are going to. So I know those are two-part questions, but I'm like excited to hear what do you have to say about both.
Yeah, man. Well, first of all, I'm eternally grateful to you, Benoy, for being such an instrumental part of my reality. Because it was, yeah, just that one moment. And you hear about this from other people about how just one set of decisions like ultimately sparked a different reality. But yeah, that chain reaction that was created by listening to the show that you had with Will and then saying, hey, can you put me in touch? And then it sparked, my coming to Sazmining and then ultimately building what we've built today. So yeah, it's a seed was planted and it's grown into a tree now, which is very cool to see. And I would have to say I have lived a very unusual reality to have gone through solar and now sort of have developed to the point where I've developed a voice within the Bitcoin mining ecosystem. And post solar, that was all outside the US. So I've spent more than a decade now outside the US. And I think you're right. I'm a US citizen, Portuguese citizen, and Peruvian resident and speak three languages and along the way. And this was just, I didn't design any of this. Like life just sort of unfolded. And I've picked up a lot. I think there's a lot that I have come to appreciate living outside the US, both about the US and think that a lot of folks in the US, because they haven't had the experience of being outside the US much, don't appreciate about other realities outside the US. I think that's normal, right? That's not me like looking down my nose at anybody. I'm not upset about it at all. But one of those is the luxury of having what the French called, I think, in the 50s or 60s, the exorbitant privilege of having the global reserve currency. It really is a privilege. And as much as inflation is a problem in the US, it's a bigger problem in so many places around the world. So I was back to Alaska. I was there with a fellow named Alex Gladstein, who is the executive director of the Human Rights Foundation. And he's written incredible books that if you're interested in the human suffering side of what money does, I can't recommend them enough. They're the great entrance. In fact, for a lot of people, it's the primary entrance that they get into Bitcoin because you realize how much Bitcoin can save a lot of the human suffering. But I was talking to Alex just a couple of weeks ago. So check your financial privilege. That would, to give a very specific book recommendation, is phenomenal. It will help you to understand exactly how privileged we are to have the dollar as our unit of account for money. But, he talks about having gone to, I can't remember which country in Africa, but when he got there, like the month before, the state had come out and devalued the currency by 40% overnight. Now, can you imagine that? Like, can you imagine, like, you've got, 3, 4 years of savings put in your bank account, and suddenly, like, you're down to 2 years of life savings just overnight. You just lost all that work. Like, that happens all the time across our planet, and it happens because it can. Governments get into bad circumstances all the time or get into critical circumstances that they need to print money or they believe they need to. And so there's all sorts of ways that they can do it. But at the end of the day, if there is a way that that currency can be debased, human history shows it will be. And the only way to avoid that circumstance is to a form of money that's outside the system. And that's why the barbaric relic that we call gold continues to have value and why you see it filling central bank coffers right now as trust is eroded in the global economy. But it's also why Bitcoin has been outperforming gold because it solves a critical technology feature that gold can't address, which is the portability. So very few people, I'll give it a second book recommendation here as well. It's called Broken Money by Lynn Alden. But she breaks down the technology behind why gold lost out to fiat currency and ultimately why Bitcoin will be the winner. But when we had wireless messaging occur, so late 1800s during the Gilded Age, Marconi got wireless messaging being transmitted from London to the US. And those first messages, few people know this, those first messages were banking transactions. So messages between banks to, do a transaction like debit this person, add to this person, right? Like that's what some of those early messages are for. When we had wireless technology, now our messages could go faster, then the gold could actually catch up to settle those transactions. And as a result, there was all sorts of derivative financial products that began to be built in the system. And the gold began to centralize as banks themselves became the trusted gatekeepers of the gold, and the moving of the gold back and forth to settle those transactions was that gold consolidated in the Bank of England and other banks around the world a lot of the banks realized, hey, we've got all the gold. If we print a few extra notes, how are people going to know? And then we had fractional reserve banking that was stimulated off of that. But the core technology issue that gold has, and why I don't ever see us going back to it as the money of that we rely on in the long term, and why I think Bitcoin wins, is because it can be transacted at the speed at which our messages can be sent, and gold can't do that.
Yeah, that's a great explanation of why, first of all, obviously the US dollar is a reserve currency and obviously hyperinflation happening in other countries, but then also the portability of Bitcoin compared to gold. And, I think that's a great explanation to give. And then obviously the two book recommendations, which we'll have on the notes of the podcast. The Solar Maverick podcast is about solar and entrepreneurship. Obviously you were very involved in the solar industry with Real Good Solar, growing that team. You're doing the same thing as mining. We have a lot of entrepreneurs listening to the podcast. Like, what suggestions would you have for entrepreneurs now that you've done it for in two different industries and two emerging industries, right? And that are emerging pretty quickly and then are going to change the way we look at currency. It's interesting. There's so many different parallels too.
I think in a lot of ways they're going to wind up colliding. Like I think this bonus depreciation combined with the loss of incentives in the solar industry are just going to push these two industries together is what I foresee happening over the not so distant future. Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Thing I was going to say was you mentioned, and this is from your talk at Bitcoin Alaska,
Mm.
about China making most of the mining facilities today or mining equipment. I don't know if you've, in the big, beautiful bill that was passed by the US government, it basically has rules on where the supply chain can come from. And there's foreign entities of concern. And that is like they're specifically focusing on China and the supply chain coming from China for both solar and battery storage. And essentially, like after a certain period of time, like you can't get the investment tax credit if certain parts of the equipment is coming from China. So I kind of have a feeling maybe this might even happen within, the mining community, but you never know. But obviously you talked about how the supply chain is diversifying for the mining equipment at the Bitcoin Alaska conference. Sorry to cut you off.
We don't have any application of the investment tax credit. So
What's
it's
that?
kind of
Yeah.
a non-issue for us, but tariffs have definitely been an issue
Oh,
in
interesting.
figuring out how to get equipment in different locations. So we're lucky. We're in Norway with a data center. We're in in Paraguay with a data center, and we're in Wisconsin with a data center. And we're looking at potentially going to Ethiopia with another data center. And the reasons why is because these are places that have an abundance of clean power, specifically hydro, that's not being monetized, that's being produced, right? And so we're there helping to basically turn a wasted good into a valuable product for the local GDP. So it's a nice win-win situation. But as far as wait, you wanted me to touch on the ITC. What was before the ITC? I'm sorry, Benoy.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I'm asking you multiple questions at the same time. So I was just
Okay.
basically saying whether the mining equipment is being diversified outside of China, where it's primarily became because you were talking about that in the beginning, then maybe suggestions that you have as an entrepreneur.
Yes, so the supply chain is diversifying. So, there's a concentration of one Chinese manufacturer made up like 82% of the supply chain of mining rigs themselves. And now that's down to like 62% in about a year. And that's coming about because there's manufacturers now in the US and other locations that are popping up. So that's a good thing. The industry's already tried to address that particular issue. But then as far as like my entrepreneurial suggestion, I think first of all, in the US, there's a lot of people that sort of culturally feel obligated to go into entrepreneurialism. And I think it requires a certain personality type. I'm just going to say straight up, it's not for everybody to be an entrepreneur. And I don't think there's any shame in that either. I think that there's no shame in just deciding I don't want to take that level of risk and I want to go earn a wage and grateful for the wage I earn and to be a contributor. So if that is you, like great. But if you do feel like, hey, I want to go out there and I want to be part of the Wild West and generate something new, by all means, go for it. Just understand that it takes grit and tenacity. And I think if I strip everything away, it's going to sound somewhat trite as to what I've really learned being an entrepreneur, but it's show up. Just no matter what, no matter how many punches you're getting, like just show up day in and day out and go forward. Even if the wind is knocking you back on your arse, like just get up and keep going forward. Things have a funny way of working themselves out. So just like the tenacity, the grit, the go forward, and a lot of the times the things that knock you down are the best lessons you learn for being able to make more progress in the future. But it's just that tenacity to continue to get up, go forward. And then the very last one that I would say is to trust your gut. And I know that that's a weird one. I'm going to say something that I discovered recently that I think is pretty interesting. There's been a podcast series that came across my desk at one point called The Telepathy Tapes. And they've caused quite a stir, whether you believe in it or not. But the idea is that telepathy within autistic kids is starting to show up quite a bit. Now, again, whether you believe in it or not is not the point. The interesting point for me, coming back to being an entrepreneur, is they've discovered actually that when they test CEOs compared to the general public, many of the CEOs actually test particularly high in their ability to sort of predict events before they occur. And to me, I heard that and I was like, well, actually, that kind of makes sense because I've sort of learned to just trust my gut things because in a weird, uncanny way, when I have is when things have turned out. And well, a lot of times when I haven't is when like problems have come up. And that sounds weird, but at the end, like I think that quote that Elon Musk has about like being an entrepreneur is like staring into the void while chewing glass is somewhat accurate. Like you are sort of called if you're going to lead the ship on an entrepreneurial effort to stare into that nothingness and to reverse entropy and turn it into order on behalf of your clients and the members of your team. And that is not for the faint of heart, but it does help to listen to your instincts when you're in that process.
Yeah, I mean, those are great suggestions. I mean, not everyone can be an entrepreneur. It's a tough life, as you know, and resilience, which is essentially what you're saying is a huge thing. And then obviously using your gut is like two of the biggest qualities. It's interesting because I feel like now I've had my own business with Renew Energy for 13 years. Like I've become a lot more aware of things and surrounding and paying attention. I'm always thinking, right? And so this whole part about telepathy and like usually I'm right with what my gut's saying or what the future state's going to be. So it was so interesting to hear
Mhm.
what you were talking about CEOs and being telepathic in a certain way. And we'll have obviously that podcast series as well in the notes of the podcast. And it's interesting too, because I know you like this quote and you used it at Bitcoin Alaska. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that's by Mike Tyson. And a lot of people can't deal with a lot of the uncertainty and the pain. You used Elon Musk quote because that uncertainty and that pain, and obviously learning from mistakes, it's challenging, right? To go through emotionally, and you get better at it as you get more experience and how you properly mentally frame things. So I appreciate you talking about it.
Yeah, I think that it's really not for the faint of heart. And it's sort of, I don't feel like it's talked enough about in the entrepreneurial journey is like it's you versus the universe on some level,
Oh,
right?
for sure.
Like it's a weird dynamic to be in, but it's like there's nobody else to hold you accountable. So if you're somebody who likes to take accountability at the highest level, then yes, you'll likely enter or end up in an entrepreneurial role. If that's not you and no shame to it, then like, yeah, don't put yourself in that position. It's not trivial.
It definitely isn't. And you did a great job of explaining that. I mean, and especially when you're talking about two industries that are not really established, right? They're emergent. So there's even more challenges. You mentioned about like the negative connotation of Bitcoin and the negative or false narratives. I mean, that's something obviously the solar industry, especially in the US, has been dealing with for a very long time. And you have actors who have a lot of money, right? And lobbying dollars who are perpetuating it and then also taking advantage of the situation, meaning that they're investing in solar and renewable energy, but they know what's going to happen in the long term. And you can't really stop it. You can't stop Bitcoin. You can't stop solar. You can't stop renewable energy. So, and you're at the intersection of it, which is pretty amazing.
It is. And let me just add one comment here because I think, so first of all, a compliment to the solar industry. I don't believe I would be successful in Bitcoin mining if I wouldn't have gone through the solar industry because of its trials and tribulations. So I feel very well prepared in mining. And there's a lot of people in the mining industry that say that Bitcoin mining is the hardest industry because it's 24/7 liquid market. And, I tell those people, you got to go try solar for a decade before you can say that, buddy. The other thing that I would mention is if you've had a knee-jerk reaction to Bitcoin mining, I'm going to challenge you, and you may not like hearing this, but just as solar has been incredibly maligned across the decades, just think if that's possible that Bitcoin has been as well, because the truth is it has been. So in a lot of ways, like solar and Bitcoin mining are maybe uncomfortable bedfellows, but bedfellows nonetheless, because there's been a lot of money that has been spent trying to convince people that the physics and the reality of these industries are not what they seem to be. And so they've been maligned. And I have a lot of sympathy and empathy for what's gone on in the solar industry and would hope that folks in the solar industry sort of dig into Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, see the opportunities there, and understand the same or similar malignment has occurred within our industry.
Yeah, and I appreciate, Kent, you spending the time to educate the solar and renewable energy community. And, I don't think we all know, like, obviously, how much Bitcoin has been maligned, like in the solar industry, and also, the congruence of both technologies, which is exciting. This has been an amazing interview. I feel like we could talk for hours. What's the best way for our audience to learn more about Sazmining, and then for you as well? I'm assuming you're obviously always looking for investors to invest in the mining projects. That's primary, I would assume.
Yeah, we've got opportunity on our website. If you want to become a miner and start generating your own Bitcoin at a lower cost, you can definitely go to our website and get that started. Of all places to find me, I'm both LinkedIn and Twitter. My handle on Twitter, which is where I'm more active because that's where more of the Bitcoin community is, at K Halliburton, or Kent Halliburton on LinkedIn. I'm sure Benoy will have links to both of those in the show notes. But yeah, please reach out. Happy to talk. I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, there might be even some career openings here at Sazmining before long that you could take advantage of. But happy to talk and help people get started because it all starts at ground zero. And I know it's a journey to understand Bitcoin. I still, in a lot of ways, feel like I'm on that journey.
Yeah, definitely. This has been an amazing interview. Thank you, Kent. I know it's a busy time and I appreciate
Yeah, one final thing. So what we've built at Sazmining is unique. It doesn't exist in the mining ecosystem. And next week, so for context, today is the 22nd of July. So next week, we're going to be launching an equity raise for the business on Timestamp Financial website. So we'll try to include links to that as well. But if you actually wanted to take ownership in what I believe is going to be the competitor to Coinbase in the future, you're very welcome to. A lot of upside, and that's why I've gone the entrepreneurial route is, there is upside to the risk.
risk and return, the basic tenet of finance. And obviously, when you have that information, yeah, we'll have that on the notes as well.
Well, wonderful talking with you as well, Benoy. We don't catch up often enough, man, but I am, like I said earlier, eternally grateful for you putting Will and I together in those early days and excited that you're still along for the journey.
Yeah, I'm excited, and it's still early too, right? As you mentioned,
Sure.
there's still a long way to go, and obviously, Will and I were talking about the amazing work that you've done at Mining, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. Likewise, keep up the good fight there in the solar industry for us.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.